Today we wrap up Outlaws at Thunder Junction big score spoilers with a mini Massacre Wurm in a land that can potentially tap for a bunch of mana. Let's break it down. Hello everyone, it's Seth, probably better known as Saffron Olive, and it's time for one final edition of Outlaws at Thunder Junction spoilers. So today we get to look at the rest of the big score spoilers. Technically there's one more spoiler that's going to come out like tonight sometime or something, but otherwise we have every single card from the big score, from the main set, from the special seeds, except for that one. But we still got some really sweet stuff to break down today. We got a land that can tap for a bunch of mana, some treasure production, some pretty janky mana rocks, which means we should probably break it down. Start talking sweet new Outlaws of Thunder Junction big score cards. Before we do, 3 quick reminders. First, if you need any of these cards, you can pre-order them from our sponsor Card Kingdom over at cardkingdom.com/MTGGoldfish. Second, to keep up on all the latest spoilers throughout the day, you should head on over to MTGpreviews.com. And 3, even though we're done with spoilers, there's still a few more spoilers to go. It is Commander Precon spoiler day for Outlaws of Thunder Junction, and Tomer's going to be covering all 4 of the new Precon decks over on the MTGGoldfish Commander YouTube, so make sure to head over there and check out those videos all day today and tomorrow. So anyway, let's talk one last time about Outlaws of Thunder Junction and the big score. First up today, we have Harvester of Misery, and this card actually looks really good to me. So it's a 5-mana 5/4, it's a black spirit creature with Menace. When it ETBs, other creatures get -2/-2 until end of turn, and then you can pay 2 and discard it to give target creature -2/-2 until end of turn. Not sure why they didn't just keyword that last mechanic channel, because it literally is channel, it just doesn't have the channel keyword. So if you think about this card, it's kind of like a cheaper Massacre Wurm. I guess the drawback is it does hit all other creatures, so it is going to shrink your creatures as well. So you probably don't want to play this in a deck full of weenies or like a bunch of tokens or something, because you're going to wrath your own board. But it does the same thing as Massacre Wurm, where it comes down and sweeps away a bunch of small creatures. The problem with Massacre Wurm is it sometimes gets stuck in your hand because it's 6 mana. I've definitely had games where I have a Massacre Wurm in my hand and I lose to an aggro deck because I just can't get it on the battlefield in time. Harvester of Misery really solves this problem. Not only is it a mana cheaper, but if you're dying to a bunch of aggro creatures, you can always just discard it for 2 mana to essentially get an expensive disfigure out of it. So I think this card has potential to be really good. One of the tricks of this card, and one of the things that makes me excited about it, especially on Magic Arena, I don't know if it'll work in like Modern, although it could, but one of the tricks we see in Modern and in Legacy is using Trolls of Khazardum's cycling ability, and then cards like Reanimate and Persist to get on the battlefield early in the game. On Arena, we're getting Reanimate. It's coming with Outlaws of Thunder Junction, and we can kind of do the same thing with Harvester, where we just take and discard this to kill a creature, and the next turn Reanimate it, get it on the battlefield. Yes, it's only a 5/4, it's not guaranteed to win the game, but it's still a pretty big threat. Plus, you can potentially discard it to kill something, and then Reanimate it to kill some more things, and get this big menacing body on the battlefield. So it seems like a sneaky reanimation target. It also just seems good against some of the popular decks in Standard, like Boros is really popular. This is going to sweep away all those Gleeful Demolition tokens, all those aggro creatures. It's good against like White Weenie style decks. So against aggro, this card is really, really sweet. It does everything that your Massacre Wurm would do. Well, it doesn't give you the damage, but it does most of what a Massacre Wurm would do, but it just does it in a way that's going to be so much easier to use, thanks to the channel mode and the fact that it's only 5 mana. So Harvester of Misery, I actually feel like this card should see play in Standard and maybe even outside of Standard, thanks to those reanimation shenanigans. We also got a wonky new land in Tarnation Vista, which I think they named to try to get people to be like, what in Tarnation? Which I guess I just did, so well done, Watsy. So Tarnation Vista, this land is kind of weird. So it enters a battlefield tapped. As it enters a battlefield, you choose a color, it makes a mana of that color, or you can pay 1 and tap it, and for each color among mono-colored permanents that you control, add 1 mana of that color. So technically, Tarnation Vista is a land that can tap for more than 1 mana. If you have 3 mono-colored permanents of different colors on the battlefield, this is essentially a Ancient Tomb or a City of Traders. If you get 4 or 5, you make even more mana, and we have seen throughout Magic's history that lands that tap for more than 1 mana are very often broken. Think about Ancient Tomb, City of Traders, Gaia's Cradle, Nykthos, Cabal Coffers. These cards are all staples, from Legacy to Commander to Modern to Pioneer. These cards are really, really good. So anytime a land can make multiple mana, it's worth taking note of. I will say that Tarnation Vista, it's got a lot of hoops you gotta jump through to make it work. I've seen some people say, oh, this is like a Gaia's Cradle at home, or a Nykthos at home. And that might be true if that home is a van down by the river. It's like the worst possible version of this effect, to the point where even though it can make multiple mana, I'm actually not sure this card is that playable. So I was looking through Standard, and I was trying to figure out, are there any existing decks in Standard that just kind of naturally meet the requirement of Tarnation Vista? And I found two. One is the 5-color Legend deck that has like Ashnod, Inti, Rona. And there is a world where you somehow get all three of these cards on the battlefield early in the game. Your Tarnation Vista, it takes 2 mana to activate, but then it makes 3 mana, so essentially get a painless Ancient Tomb out of it. You do have to play a tap land, which throws the curve off, so it's not going to happen very early in the game, but that is a possibility. The only other deck I found that technically meets the requirement, even though we have a bunch of 3-color decks in the format, is actually the Agatha Soul Cauldron combo deck that's got like Sleep Curse Fairy, Kami, Realm Scourge Hydra. So there are decks that could theoretically take advantage of it. Even in those situations, is it really worth it? You're playing a tap land that only makes 1 color of mana. For the upside of, if you draw 3 very specific cards, your land makes 1 more mana, I'm actually not even sure that's going to be worth it. I've seen some people point out a Killer Among Us. A Killer Among Us for 5 mana makes 4 different colors worth of 1/1 tokens, so that means your Tarnation Vista is going to make 2 extra mana. The downside is that means you're playing a deck built around a Killer Among Us, so it might be a case of like playing bad cards to try to make bad cards better. Honestly, maybe the easiest way to abuse this might be Blossoming Tortoise. Blossoming Tortoise just reduces the cost of activating Tarnation Vista, so it costs 0, which means you only need 2 different colors of monocolor permanents to turn it into an Ancient Tomb, so maybe a Blossoming Tortoise deck could take advantage of it, but I think this card's going to be really, really tricky to use. Once you get back to Modern, like, the same thing is true. You could play Esper Sentinel, Ragavan, Orcish Bowmasters, 3 of the strongest cards in the format. They're all monocolored, they're all cheap, to try to get extra mana out of Tarnation Vista, but is it going to be worth it? And like, can you even stick these cards on the battlefield? What are the odds? It's hard to keep 3 creatures on the battlefield, let alone 3 monocolored creatures of different colors. If you draw 2 Esper Sentinels or 2 Orcish Bowmasters, it doesn't really do anything. So I feel like this card, oh boy, I never want to write off a land that can make multiple mana. It's always a mistake. There's just such a risk that someone will figure out a way to break this card, and it'll be like super expensive and super busted in a specific deck. But my gut reaction is this card is probably too safe to be broken. Even though it can make multiple mana, I think coming into play tapped, only making 1 color of mana, not having any relevant land types, you can't fetch it or anything, and then caring specifically about monocolored permanents makes it just too hard for decks to use. So I don't want to write it off completely, but this seems like the safest soul land that we've ever seen. Also, just so it's super clear, it cares only about monocolored permanents. I saw some people are like, wow, this is going to be busted with Leyline of the Guild pack. Just turn 0 Leyline, play this, make a bunch of mana. Doesn't actually work that way, because multicolor permanents actually don't do anything with this. As far as Commander goes, I think there's a couple specific decks where this could be interesting. One is like Goshen Tai of Life's Origins. Goshen Tai is kind of a 5-color enchantment deck, and remember, Tarnation Vista cares about any permanent, so you can play enchantments to help turn it on. Plus, you're probably playing the enchantment shrine creatures, which are going to be all different colors, and they're all monocolored, so it seems like it could be good there. The other place it's kind of interesting is in Slivers. Slivers tend to be monocolored permanents that are split across the color pie, so I think like the first Sliver could maybe take advantage of it. So I don't want to say there's no uses for this card. I think there are specific decks where it could work, but I will say, I think it's often going to end in disappointment. I just think it's going to be too hard to actually turn on, and the cost of being tapped and only making 1 color of mana means there is a relatively high opportunity cost to put this in your deck. If you're only going to turn this on like once in every 10 games or something, it's not going to be worth it, right? The upside is just not going to be worth the cost. If you can build a deck that's consistently making multiple mana out of this, then this card's insane. Like, any land that makes 2 mana is insane, so if you can pull it off, good for you, go for it. I just think it's probably going to be a little bit too tricky for most decks to do. We also got a new red 2-drop. Grizzly Bear set. I swear to God, so many Grizzly Bears in this set. In Generous Plunderer. So Generous Plunderer, a 2-mana 2/2 human rogue with menace. It says at the beginning of your upkeep, you can create a treasure token. When you do, target opponent creates a tap treasure token. And then when it attacks, it deals damage to defending player equal to the number of artifacts they control. So this card, for Standard, I'm kind of skeptical. I've seen in the past that 2-drops that make treasures can be really good. I like Wily Goblin a lot. I've played that in way too many decks. Magda can make treasures. The problem with Generous Plunderer is it's kind of a group hug card. Like, sure, you get a treasure, but you're also giving your opponent a treasure. Yeah, it's tapped, so they can't immediately just cut down your Generous Plunderer or whatever, but still, that's kind of a big drawback. You're not just generating mana for you, you're ramping your opponent into their shield or into their sweeper, into their removal. Yeah, you get a little extra damage out of Generous Plunderer, but I don't think it's actually going to be worth it. So in 1v1 formats, I think this card is probably just unplayable, with one exception, which is it is actually an interesting way to punish artifact decks. You don't have to choose to make treasures with this, and in some ways it reminds me of Sardine Avenger, in that it gets really big and deals a ton of damage if your opponent has a bunch of artifacts. So if your opponent's playing an artifact deck, like the Unstable Glyph Bridge, blue-white artifact deck, maybe a Sir Ginger deck, some sort of affinity deck, something that's making a ton of like clues and maps and treasures, then this could be a good sideboard card, even if you don't choose to give your opponent a treasure, because it does trigger when it attacks, right? It doesn't even have to get in combat damage. So if your opponent just has like 5 or 6 artifacts on the battlefield, you just swing with this and hit your opponent for a huge chunk of damage. So I could see this being good sideboard tech to keep artifact decks in line if they get out of control. As far as Commander is concerned, in Commander I like this card quite a bit better, because in Commander, you're only giving one opponent a treasure token, and you can use this as a political tool, right? You can give it to the person who's mana screwed and kind of curry some favor with them politically, so you get to choose. So just giving one opponent out of your 3 opponents a treasure isn't that big of a deal. Plus in Commander, I've seen Sardine Avenger do some serious work, because a lot of decks are built around mana rocks, there's a lot of artifact token decks, so I could see this card dealing a ridiculous amount of damage. So I actually think I would just jam this, especially in a treasure themed deck in Commander, and plan on activating it pretty much every turn, and just trying to use it like a political tool. So if you're playing like Magda, Mr. House, Agnes, Jolene, any sort of treasure themed deck, I think this card's really good. Plus, it could just be, again, like a tech card to punish the artifact player in your play group. If you got someone that's just popping off with the artifact deck, this is a good way to get their life total low really, really quickly. The other way you could play this is just in a group hug deck. Just embrace the fact that it's going to give your opponent value, but if that's what your deck's about, because you're playing like K&T or whatever, some sort of group hug deck, then it's fine to give your opponents treasures, because that's kind of what you signed up for if you're playing group hug. So Generous Plunderer, maybe a sideboard card for 60 card formats. I really don't see it as a main deck card, though. I don't think you can just play this and be like, I'm just going to give both players treasures every turn. It's probably going to end up hurting you as much as it helps you, but in the matchup against the artifact deck, really good. Plus a cool commander card for politic decks, group hug decks, and treasure themed decks. We also got a new green mana rock in Ancient Cornucopia, and this I think is one of the weakest cards in the entire set. So it's a 3 mana green mana rock. It taps to add 1 mana of any color, and it says whenever you cast a spell that's 1 or more colors, you can gain a life for each of its colors. Do this only once each turn. So this is a mana rock that can also gain you some life. So the big problem I have with this card, even though I'm a believer in 3 mana rocks, I'm not one of those people that's just like, oh, it's 3 mana, it's bad. I like 3 mana rocks. I play them all the time. My problem with this card is it's green, and I firmly believe if you're playing Commander and you're a green deck, you should play literally 0 mana rocks. Maybe there's occasionally an exception, but I don't even play like Arcane Signet in my green decks. I guess Soul Ring gets a pass just because it's so busted and shouldn't even exist. But outside of that, I just don't play mana rocks, because if you're green, the way you should ramp is Nature Source and 3 Visits and Cultivates and Secure Tribe Elders and Open the Ways and Farseeks and Rampant Grows. You should be putting extra lands on the battlefield, because the sad truth of Commander is lands are sacrosanct. You can't actually blow up your opponent's lands. It's a taboo. You're not allowed to do it in the format, but you're very much allowed to blow up your opponent's mana rocks. So the biggest upside of having green in your deck in Commander is you get to play ramp that your opponents aren't allowed to interact with. So I don't really see the use case for this card. Like, if I'm a green deck, I don't want a mana rock, period, let alone Ancient Cornucopia, which is technically a 3 mana rock with upside, and incidental life gain is a nice upside, but I don't think it's enough for me to be like, you know what, I'm going to play this easy to blow up piece of rap when I could just be playing another Cultivate or Nature's Lore, Kadama's Reach style effect. I've heard some people talk about, like, what about a life gain deck? And honestly, I don't think it's really worth it there either. Like, Pristine Talisman exists, that's gaining you a life each turn. Celestis, I really do like, but it also loots, which is why it kind of gets a pass. It's not just for the life gain, but I don't think it's worth playing this specifically to gain life. I think gaining life incidentally is an upside, but you don't want to play bad cards to gain life. life, and I think Ancient Cornucopia is just a bad card in a deck with green. The only exception I could maybe see to this is some sort of like 5-color deck that is also going to mostly play at instant speed. So like Niv Mizzet Reborn tends to be a 5-color deck with a lot of multicolor cards that also usually plays a lot of instants and sorceries, like a lot of charms and so forth. Because remember, Ancient Cornucopia, while it only triggers once each turn, you can trigger on your opponent's turn. So if you're a deck with a bunch of multicolor cards that's going to be casting spells during each of your opponent's turn, this could easily be gaining you like 6, 8, 10 life a turn cycle, and that actually might make it worth it. So I think I'd consider it maybe in Niv Mizzet Reborn or like Ramos if I'm mostly playing instant speed in super multicolor heavy. But even there, I'm not convinced that it's better than just playing another Cultivator, Kadama's Reach, or a land ram spell, because this gets blown up and lands you're not allowed to blow up in Commander. Finally, we have Fomori Vault, and this land is actually pretty strong. So it's a colorless land, but it comes into play untapped, so opportunity cost fairly low, and then you can pay 3 and tap it, discard a card to look at the top X cards of your library, where X is the number of artifacts you control. Put one of those cards in the hand, the rest on the bottom of your library in a random order. So this is an untapped colorless land that essentially lets you discard a card to Machine 8, or I guess Merchant Stockhand is another comparison that's pretty similar. And I think this card's actually really good. So in an artifact deck, I think this is like your War Room. There are some differences here. So technically, Fomori's Vault isn't going to generate card advantage. It really generates card selection, because you do have to discard a card. So you're not going to be +1 card in hand. On the other hand, Fomori's Vault, if you're playing a deck that has a reasonable amount of artifacts, it's going to be digging super deep in your deck. War Room is just giving you the top card of your deck. It might be another land that you don't really need. Fomori's Vault, you're going to be seeing 5, 10, 20 cards, some big amount of cards, and that's going to be almost like tutoring. You're going to discard an extra land to grab something really, really good. So I think in artifact decks in specific, this card kind of feels like a staple to me. I know we have so many good utility lands now that you can't really play all of them, but in an artifact deck, I think this is your War Room, your upgraded War Room. In standard, I think the Thousand Moon Smithy deck, probably the most likely option. I don't think you can play this if you just incidentally make a couple artifacts. I don't think that's really going to be worth it. But if you're a dedicated artifact deck where that's kind of your gimmick, and we might have more of these thanks to the big score, which is kind of themed after artifacts, then I think this card is really good. It comes into play on tap. So yeah, it might be tough in like a 4 or 5 color deck, but if you're like a monocolor, 2-color, maybe even 3-color artifact deck, I think this is certainly in the conversation. Is a card you're going to play a lot of the time. And then I guess I could see a world where like some Urza deck in Modern, maybe some like Thought Monitor Affinity deck and like Historic or Timeless could take advantage of this. Those decks make a lot of mana. They can get away with playing some colorless lands. They're going to have a lot of artifacts. So it seems good there as well. Also kind of sneaky in artifact token decks like Academy Manufacture decks. You just get so many artifact tokens on the battlefield that this is almost going to be like discard a card to Demonic Tutor and just find your best piece of your deck. Also like the Asmore decks can make a lot of artifact tokens, so there's some sneaky homes there as well. In Commander, like I said, it kind of reminds me of the War Room. It's got the same activated cost. It's going to generate card selection, and in Commander, a lot of decks are playing Mana Rocks, and I'm actually on the fence is whether you can just play this in a Mana Rock deck. Let's say you're a mono blue deck and you're playing like 10 or 12 Mana Rocks and maybe a couple other incidental artifacts. Is this going to be worth it? I'm going to lean towards no. I'm going to say that you just play War Room instead in that scenario, but if you're an artifact theme deck, a Breya deck, an Osgir deck, a Chisgoria deck, a Urza deck, a Karn deck, then I think this is going to be one of the strongest utility lands in your entire deck. Also goes up even more in value in colorless artifact decks. In a colorless Commander deck, you just have so much room for colorless utility lands that this is always going to make the cut. The other place, like I said before, this is going to be kind of absurd, is in decks that make a lot of artifact tokens. So like Lannis, for example, usually has like 5, 10 clues on the battlefield. In a deck like that, this is really solid. Same with Samwise or Agnes or Magda. If you're making a ton of treasures or clues or maps or bloods or whatever, this is in the conversation there as well. So Fomori's Vault, not a card for every deck, because some decks are just not going to have enough artifacts to support it. But in the decks with enough artifacts to support it, this is an incredibly strong utility land that you're going to play very, very often. Anyway, that that brings us to the end, not just of our daily Outlaws of Thunder Junction big score spoilers for today, but to the end of our spoiler season altogether. There's technically one more card that's going to get spoiled from the vault sometime tonight or tomorrow. I maybe do a short for that one. I don't think I'll do a whole video just for one card, but there's one card remaining. I don't know when exactly it's going to come out, but otherwise, that brings us to the end of spoiler season. However, if you're a Commander fan, it's Commander Precon Day, and Tomer's going to be covering all the Commander Precons on the MTGGoldfish Commander YouTube, so make sure to check that out over the next couple of days. Should have like 4 different videos, I think, going over each of the decks with the spoilers as they come out, so make sure to check that out as well. And of course, we're going to have a ton of other Outlaws of Thunder Junction stuff coming up. Next Wednesday's Early Access Day, so head over to the Twitch in the afternoon. We're going to try out some new decks. We'll have Commander Clash episodes. We'll have tons of Modern and Standard and Timeless and all those formats showing off the new cards, so keep an eye out for that on the YouTube over the next few days. And of course, on Monday's podcast, we will talk about the best constructed cards from Outlaws of Thunder Junction and the big score. So thanks for hanging out this spoiler season, everyone. I hope you enjoyed it. And I will be back in a few weeks with Modern Horizons 3 spoilers, which should be starting the end of May sometime, the middle end of May. So until then, everyone, thanks for hanging out this spoiler season. I love y'all. Have an amazing day, and I will talk to you soon. Looking for even more magic? Well, you can check out yesterday's daily spoiler video here, or maybe last night's Against the Odds, where we extracted all of our opponent's non-land cards in Standard.